Okay, so you ever get stuck on this? I mean, like, I'm all about learning, right? Always trying to dig deeper into stuff. But then you bump into this wall. Why doesn't just knowing more actually stop people from believing things that are just, well, flat out wrong?
Yeah, that's a really good question. You'd think, right? More education, less likelihood of falling for misinformation. It seems like, I don't know, a pretty straightforward idea.
Totally. It's almost like you assume education's this shield. Like, the more you learn, the tougher it gets to penetrate.
Yeah.
But the stuff we're looking at today, this article, it throws a real curveball into that whole idea.
Yeah, it uses this example of Trump and his supporters, specifically the MGA, that's MAGA, pronounced MAGA crowd. And the question it asks is, how come people who might be super educated, maybe even in fields where thinking critically is like the whole point, still end up holding on to beliefs that don't quite match up with, reality?
That's it, right there. That's the heart of what we're going to try to unpack in this deep dive. It's not about pointing fingers. It's about trying to understand how beliefs really work.
Hmm.
So what we're aiming for is to figure out why that simple equation, more education equals fewer wrong beliefs, doesn't always add up.
Yeah.
And then, maybe see if there are better ways to navigate this whole crazy information world we live in.
Makes sense. So to start, let's just lay out that basic assumption we were talking about. The idea that more time in school automatically equals more, well, accurate beliefs. And the article really goes after this.
Yeah.
It's kind of fascinating when you think about it, how much we connect higher education with like smarter thinking and being less susceptible to believing stuff that's not true. But I mean, look around. The article uses the example of some Trump or MAGA, sticking with that pronunciation supporters, and
Yeah.
it's clear the reality is a bit more complicated.
You see it all the time. People with all these degrees and fancy titles sharing or straight up believing stuff that just doesn't hold water,
Yeah.
especially in these superheated political and cultural debates. And the article, it nails this by asking, why do seemingly educated Trump MAGA supporters, to be precise, sometimes just like stick to misinformation? It's not about picking on anyone. It's about trying to get at this disconnect between how much education someone has and, well, what they choose to believe.
Exactly. And to help make sense of that disconnect, the article zeroes in on this word liberalism. Now, and this is super important to keep in mind, this word's meaning has gone through some, let's say, interesting changes over time. Originally, liberalism was about a specific political philosophy. Think individual freedoms, democracy, human rights, equality under the law, free markets, that kind of stuff. If you think about it, those are ideas that a lot of people, no matter their political leanings, could at least agree on in principle.
It's funny, right? You look at that original meaning and you're like, well, yeah, those all sound pretty good. But then, as the article explains, things get a little, well, twisted. Especially when we're talking about Trump and his MAGA base. Liberal has basically morphed into this catch-all label, and it's almost always used negatively.
That's a really key point. You see, for a lot of Trump and MAGA supporters, liberal isn't just describing a political view anymore. It's like an insult. It's this way to paint whoever they disagree with politically as being totally out of touch with regular Americans, like elitist, even unpatriotic. And that sets up a very strong us versus them kind of feeling.
It's so clever, too. You lump this whole group of people together as the liberals, make them the bad guys, causing all the problems, and suddenly it's way easier to just ignore anything they say, facts or no facts. It's like a mental shortcut to avoid actually having to deal with different ideas.
It really is. And tying back to what we were talking about before, this way of talking about liberals just reinforces that sense of shared identity among MAGA supporters. They're united against this supposed enemy. And what's kind of ironic, the article points this out, is that a lot of the values those same supporters hold dear are actually rooted in, you guessed it, that original classical understanding of liberalism that they're so busy criticizing.
Right. It's a bit of a head scratcher when you think about it too long.
Hmm.
Okay, so we're seeing that just having more education doesn't equal more, let's say, accurate beliefs.
Yeah.
And even the words we use, like liberal, can get in the way of clear thinking. So let's get to this. Why don't those critical thinking classes we all hear about actually do a better job of fighting misinformation, especially in these supercharged political areas?
That's where things get really interesting, and the article gives a few main reasons why this happens. First, it talks about what we might call like the surface level use of critical thinking. A lot of times, education in this area focuses on stuff like spotting logical fallacies, understanding how arguments are structured, that kind of thing.
Yeah, those are definitely good skills to have.
Totally. But they often miss this like deeper level of emotional and identity biases that really drive what we believe. You know what I mean?
That makes total sense. You can be amazing at finding those gotcha moments in an argument, but that doesn't mean you won't be swayed by something that just feels right emotionally, especially if it backs up how you see yourself and your place in the world. The article mentions this directly, saying that knowing how to build a strong argument doesn't protect you from being manipulated emotionally, which is a really important point.
For sure. And this leads us to the next point. How much stronger identity is compared to logic, especially when we're talking about beliefs. When what we believe is tied up in who we are, patriotism, cultural background, religion, like the article talks about with some MAGA folks, then disagreeing with those beliefs feels like a direct attack. It's not just saying that fact's wrong, it's like saying you're wrong as a person.
Yeah, and
Uh,
nobody likes being told they're wrong as a person.
no.
So, of course, they push back. The article makes this point really well. Those emotional ties often have a much stronger pull than logic, even when the logic is solid.
Exactly. And then you've got this like tag team duo, confirmation bias and motivated reasoning. So the article points out that just because someone has more education, it doesn't make them more objective. It might just mean they're better at finding stuff that backs up what they already think and at explaining away anything that doesn't. So instead of education removing bias, it can almost make it worse,
Yeah.
make people better at cherry picking evidence to support their existing beliefs. Just to be clear, confirmation bias is like our natural tendency to seek out info that confirms what we already believe. Motivated reasoning is how we twist information to fit our beliefs, even if it goes against the actual evidence.
That's so true. You see it all the time. People finding just the right bits of data, twisting arguments to fit their worldview. It's like having this super powerful computer, your brain,
Yeah.
but you're only using it to visit the same websites you always agree with.
Right. It's not really using the full potential there. And then we can't forget about the influence of cultural framing and, well, just plain propaganda. So the article brings up how, for example, some conservative media outlets are really good at telling their audiences to be skeptical of anything that challenges their views. They even go so far as to frame education itself as some kind of liberal indoctrination. And when that's the main message within a community, it's almost impossible for traditional education to make any headway.
It's a self-fulfilling prophecy almost, isn't it? You're told to distrust the very places that are supposed to be giving you unbiased information, so anything they say that you don't like, well, you're primed to reject it.
Absolutely. We also have to factor in how messages resonate emotionally and how different groups often have totally different moral compasses. Research actually shows that people from different political backgrounds tend to value different moral principles. For example, someone might be super moved by arguments about fairness and caring for others, while someone else, maybe a MAGA supporter, as the article suggests, might be more swayed by arguments about loyalty, authority, or freedom. So even the most logically sound argument can totally flop if it doesn't line up with someone's core sense of right and wrong.
You hit the nail on the head. It's not enough for something to be factually correct. It has to speak to your gut feeling about what's right and what's wrong. If that connection's not there, the message just bounces right off.
Exactly. And one last thing the article touches on is this widespread distrust of institutions in general, not just educational ones. If someone already believes that colleges and universities are biased, anything they learn there that goes against their personal beliefs is going to get tossed out immediately. It's almost like that skepticism acts as a filter, blocking anything that doesn't already fit their worldview.
So basically, we're seeing why education alone isn't always the silver bullet. Sure, it gives people tools, but it doesn't get at the deeper reasons why they cling to certain beliefs so strongly. The article really drives home this point. Just throwing more facts and logic at the problem isn't the answer. People need to want to change their minds, and that's a whole different ballgame.
That's the key. Traditional education often focuses on how to think critically, but it forgets about why we believe the things we do, and even more importantly, about making people actually want to reconsider those beliefs when new information comes along.
Okay, so if more facts and logic isn't the magic solution, what does the article suggest we do to fight misinformation more effectively?
It offers a few pretty interesting alternatives. The first is to teach critical thinking, not just as a bunch of rules, but as a way to become more aware of your own emotions. That means helping people understand how their feelings and their sense of identity shape what they believe.
That's like a whole different perspective, looking inward instead of outward. The article mentions things like self-reflection exercises, where people are encouraged to ask, why do I believe this? Instead of, can I defend this? That little change seems huge.
It is. It encourages this deeper self-awareness, helps people recognize their own biases. The next strategy is what they call empathy-based engagement. So instead of immediately trying to tear down someone's beliefs with facts, you start by connecting with their values, using personal stories and shared experiences to find common ground. The idea is that building those connections can be way more persuasive than just throwing data at them.
That makes a lot of sense. If you feel like someone actually gets where you're coming from and respects your viewpoint, you're probably going to be more open to hearing what they have to say, even if it challenges your beliefs.
Exactly. The third strategy is to tackle those emotional triggers head on. The article suggests having open conversations about how propaganda works, how emotional manipulation and playing on people's identities is used to sway opinions. By making people aware of these tactics, the hope is that they'll become less susceptible to them.
It's like exposing the tricks, right? Instead of just focusing on individual examples of misinformation, you show how it's done. Kind of like revealing how a magic trick works. Once you know the secret, it's not so impressive anymore.
Exactly. The fourth thing the article talks about is the importance of promoting intellectual humility. That means encouraging people to be open to the possibility of being wrong, to admit their own biases, and to create a culture where changing your mind when you learn new stuff is seen as a good thing, a sign of strength, not weakness.
Wow, that's a big shift, culturally speaking. We're so used to thinking that sticking to our beliefs no matter what is a sign of strength and conviction, even when all the evidence is telling us to rethink things. Building a world where it's okay to say, you know what, I was wrong, seems like a really important step.
It's huge. And finally, the article suggests encouraging what it calls decentralized education and discussion, basically creating more chances for respectful conversations across those political divides, but in smaller, more casual settings, places where people feel comfortable asking questions, exploring different viewpoints, without feeling judged or talked down to.
So, smaller, more personal conversations where people actually feel heard and respected instead of those big, often heated debates. That sounds way more promising.
It is. The idea is to create spaces where disagreements are seen as opportunities to learn from each other, not as battles that have to be won.
So to sum it all up, it sounds like the big takeaway is this. Yeah, critical thinking skills are super important, but they're not the only thing that matters when you're trying to combat misinformation, especially in areas where emotions run high. We also have to consider the emotional and identity-related reasons why people hold on to their beliefs so tightly.
Exactly. It's about understanding the why behind the what. And for you, as someone who's always looking to learn and grow, I think this offers some valuable insights into your own information habits and how you interact with people who see the world differently.
Absolutely. It makes you think, if education alone isn't enough, then what role do personal responsibility and community play in building a world where people are more informed? And what are some concrete things we can do as individuals to apply these alternative strategies, focusing on emotional awareness, empathy, intellectual humility, our everyday lives and conversations? Those are some really good questions to think about. Thanks for diving into this with us today.